All right, well, we might as well get started. I just want to make a point of letting everybody know that we're recording the talk, and we'll most likely share it online afterwards. So just so that you're aware. And it's a small sort of intimate group, but to sort of do the kind of formalities of introductions, right? I mean, my name is, Dustin O'Hara. I'm the director of the Internet Studies Center at Western Washington University. The lecture series, we like to bring in people from a wide range of fields to sort of help us understand digital technologies from different perspectives, understanding sort of its place in the world. And today we have Brian Kinnee. Is that your last name? I pronounced it right? Yeah.
Yes.
Brian is a PhD student in human-centered design and engineering at the University of Washington and a member of the Tactile and Tactile Design Lab. Kinnee's work explores the leaky limits of domestic technologies in queer spaces. I'm curious where this language of leaky limits comes from. It really, caught me. I was like, whoa, okay. The leaky limits. Their recent work focuses on questions of queer use among conversational agents and the development of audio experimentation and remixing methods as modes of sociotechnical inquiry. That's great. So
thank you.
Daniela Rosner is an associate professor in human-centered design and engineering at the University of Washington and co-director of the Tactile and Tactile Tactile and Tactical Design Lab. I guess there's maybe a typo in the previous one. Yeah, her research investigates the social, political, and material circumstances of technology and development and use, with a longstanding interest in sites of innovation historically marginalized within engineering cultures. And she's also the editor-in-chief of Interactions magazine, a bi-monthly publication from ACM, the Association for Computing Machinery. So with all of that, thank you, both of you, for coming. I'm really excited to learn about your work. So take it away.
Okay. Thank you so much for that introduction, Dustin. I really appreciate it. Today, I'm going to be sharing my research for a project that I've been working on for quite some time. And it's very interesting now to sort of look back at this project and see all that we have done and all the things that we're still doing. I really think this work has changed my thinking and also me as a person. So hopefully that'll make some more sense as I go in the talk today. This project is called Sonic Technologies of a Queer Breakup. And this is a collaboration between myself, Daniela Rosner, who is here today, also presenting, and Audrey Desjardins. We are all at the University of Washington in Seattle. Daniela and I are in the Human-Centered Design and Engineering department, and Audrey is in the Department of Art History, and Design. And this work was also supported by the National Science Foundation, the grant number 1947696. I've already said thank you a few times, but I really want to say thanks again because this is just such a cool opportunity, and I'm very curious about what you all are thinking about in terms of internet studies and how this makes sense in your work and in your lives. I'm also going to begin with just a few acknowledgements. Again, thank you, Dustin, for this opportunity. Thank you, Daniela and Audrey, as my doctoral research advisors for their curiosity, their mentorship, their care, and their collaboration throughout this work. And then I'd also like to thank the members of the Tactile and Tactical Design Lab, the TAT Lab, for sharing their feedback and for helping us workshop these ideas and the methods in the research. I'd also like to take this moment for us to each pause and reflect on the lands on which we are tuning into or tuning in from today. This land acknowledgement is for Seattle, where I'm speaking from today, and we acknowledge the people past, present, and future of the Coast Salish, Stilaguamish, Duwamish, Suquamish, and other tribes on whose traditional lands we study and work. I recommend that if you are not already using some headphones, that you find some and put them on or put them in. And I'd like to start today by playing a brief sound clip for you all that I will unpack and uncover throughout today's talk.
Thanks, Alexa. Alexa. 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 Thanks, Alexa.
Listening to this sound clip, what are some things that you noticed? And could you identify the sounds? Could you put a name to it? And did any of them sound familiar? This composition was made just using GarageBand and a series of audio clips that were sampled from the Alexa devices that were in my home during the course of this study. These audio clips were also files that were labeled by the Alexa devices themselves as, quote, not intended for Alexa. And I found this really fascinating and wanted to make something out of the sounds that were supposedly not intended for this device. This is just one of many different forms of experimentation that we took on during this work. And using sounds from our everyday spaces and everyday lives as a way of understanding and maybe even making strange things that happen every single day is really fascinating to me. I think that there's so much that we can learn from just listening closely to what's around us. And this work is trying to harness the potential for these domestic devices like Alexa, Google Assistant, and Siri as digital assistants to help us understand ourselves in new ways. And I'd also like you all to consider, perhaps throughout this talk or just in general, how has technology in your home or homes played a role in your relationship or your relationships? I'm going to begin by giving an overview of the research. This is the first page of the paper that we will be presenting at the Designing Interactive Systems conference fairly soon. This conference is one of the places that people in the fields of human-computer interaction and design come together to talk about the status of or the state of technology in society. And in particular, this conference focuses on designing interactive systems. And so this work that I'm presenting with you all today has been prepared for that audience. However, I've tried to make some adjustments for sharing it with you all today. But if there are a few moments where I'm using some jargon, some big fancy words, or am speaking in other language that is confusing, then this might be part of why, but I just wanted to give a bit of a disclaimer. So there are a few things like my last name will appear and I'll try to just say me, but that could be difficult sometimes while I'm doing it. And I also use some pseudonyms for people that were involved in this study. So I use the pseudonyms Warlock and Michael to refer to my two partners that I had during this study. And again, more on that soon. So over the past decade, the growth of voice assistants has presented new challenges within domestic life. And prior research has shown that such technologies affect users unevenly or fail to account for some relationships and domesticities entirely. Our work investigates the under-examined topic of queerness at home. Drawing on the experience of queer breakup, we describe a design inquiry and a first-person research approach exploring two concurrent relationships in separate households, both using Alexa. We explore issues of temporality, glitch, and shared accountability. We also ask critical questions with audio experiments, including how do voice assistants differentiate between queer voices? How should we converse with voice assistants about queerness? in Our Voice Assistants Queer Enough? We contribute a discussion of difference, inclusion, and queer cultures of adversarial use to highlight the limitations of both everyday and professional language for describing and analyzing the particulars of queerness in interaction design. To provide some backgrounds and share some related works, the study of sonic technologies and queer heartbreak comes out of 3 connected bodies of work at the intersections of digital sound studies, theories of queer temporality, and digitally mediated intimacies in design and HCI. For the presentation today, I'm going to be focusing primarily on theories of queer temporality and digitally mediated intimacies in design and HCI. We take particular inspiration from the paradoxical positioning of technological development within queer life. And where existing work has emphasized the widespread societal toll of algorithmically encoded bias on queer subjectivities, we look to their situated and generative potential. We wonder how glitches and oversights might lend themselves to alternative readings of voice assistants in queer life. And examining this potential while recognizing hardship takes exposing some of the most personal and mundane aspects of queerness, beginning with intimate relationships. The methods that we took in order to perform this design inquiry was a design inquiry and a first-person design research. So in this paper, we presented a combined autoethnographic and design inquiry into domestic sonic technologies and queer experience. By following one person's experiences across 2 homes, 2 Alexa devices, and 2 queer relationships, we explored the contours of encoding queerness and/or queer phobia and voice assistant devices, design approaches, and designed interactions. Across 9 months of use, and after processing 3 weeks of sonic breakup data from Amazon's Alexa, we learned that glitches and voice assistant prescripts are interwoven with the soundscapes of everyday life, and that Alexa's recordings can challenge a sense of non-normative time through reminders and memories. Our sonic experimentation led to further insights about the richness of the voice assistant recordings, how Alexa's system differentiates across voices, and how its processes of translation and transcription reveal opportunities for countering queer erasure. We end with potential strategies for design researchers to bring more nuance and complexity to the limitations wrought by binary and queerphobic logics, bringing new attention to the forms of queer resistance inherent in everyday lived experience with smartness at home. We have many findings for this. In fact, some of them are still bubbling up. In this section of the paper, we offer 2 main themes for examining the intersections of voice assistant technology, queerness, relationships, breakup, and my lived experience. First, we discuss the various ways that Alexa encountered queer breakup and how that intersected with my experience. Second, we unpack how we used sound to understand queer breakup through a series of listening and remixing exercises like the one that you heard at the start of the talk today. The following are some of the questions that arose during our individual and collective sonic experimentation processes. What if a bias that is designed to help an imagined, more normative person ends up also being helpful to an unimagined queer person? Does this mean that the design was queer or queer enough all along? And at what point does a generalized recommendation become a heteronormative recommendation? How might we queer interaction design without targeting, profiling, silencing, invisibilizing, or excluding people in the process? This is an example of an entry from an interaction with Alexa. In working with this data, we're provided with a machine transcription from the Alexa devices. And you can also hear the audio from the interaction. So this entry, I'm going to play the audio clip first.
Alexa, my boyfriend just broke up with me.
There's a lot of background noise in that sound, which is interesting. To which the Alexa device responded, "Sorry to hear that. Talking to a friend, listening to music, or taking a walk may help. I hope you feel better soon." What's significant about this interaction is that Alexa provided a set of recommendations. And while at first glance, these recommendations may seem like commonplace things that you would tell somebody in this situation, we can also see that there are many assumptions that are embedded into this. There are assumptions about how many friends you may have available to you, or that you can talk to a friend, that you are a listening person, or that you are a walking person. And these kinds of assumptions are not anything for us to ignore or dismiss, because they have the potential to affect us at these moments of our lives that are already full of turmoil and struggle. Asking Alexa, what is a breakup, can sometimes reveal a response that is pulled straight from the web at a source like Wikipedia. And in this definition, we see Alexa in some ways, and at the same time, Alexa is providing a basic definition for a breakup. However, in doing so, they're describing the term dumping to somebody who was just dumped, which is really quite interesting to me. Where a breakup is typically called a separation or divorce, or seeing the term applied likely to a married couple, is again assumptions of normativity in relationships. So normativity in assistance might want us to ask, what kinds of conversations should we have with voice assistants, and what kinds of conversations should we not have? How might conversations with voice assistants about or around queer breakup illuminate the baked-in values and assumptions of an interactive system? While Alexa's recommendations for my queer heartbreak were normative, they still helped me. And this nuance definitely textured my own and my collaborators' understandings of bias in these technologies that we live with and talk to on a very regular basis. I have a few more examples of bias in assistance that I'd like to share. This one is, again, asking about breakup.
What can I do to help feel better after a breakup?
And again, Alexa pulls something from the web, saying that keeping active and doing things you enjoy may help to keep your mind off the breakup. And again, we can see that there are some assumptions here about what kind of activity somebody might be able to do while in this state, or just in general.
Alexa, my boyfriend just broke up with me.
Alexa's response is, sorry to hear that. Talking to a friend, listening to music, or taking a walk may help. I hope you feel better soon. Again, this example is one of the most powerful because it has not just one, but multiple assumptions embedded within it. This is the final example from this set, in which I asked Alexa,
how long does heartache last?
That was, how long does heartache last? To which they replied, Heartache by One OK Rock is 4 minutes and 24 seconds. And this is true. There is a song called Heartache by a group called One OK Rock, and it is 4 minutes and 24 seconds long. At the moment of this interaction, I was pretty stunned because it was so unexpected. And on one hand, it had fulfilled my request and answered my question, but at the same time, I did not know how to ask this device then this question without using those exact words or to get this response. Moving on to the discussion of the bias in assistance, we've so far explored the range of subtle but notable ways that one person's queer heartbreak brings new readings of smartness at home. And using the Alexa voice assistant service across 2 devices, 2 homes, and 2 queer relationships exposes some of the taken for granted assumptions that are built into a smart device. Our analysis and audio experiments help design researchers conceptualize what it means for a voice to be recognizable, for a reminder to permeate distinct spaces and times, and for a device that reinforces heteronormative assumptions to create conditions for imagining a relationship otherwise. My domestic life exposes challenges to interpretation, gaps in translation, but also the somatic and often surprising pleasures that come from being with an imperfect NLP service. That is natural language processing. We reflect on these tensions between queerness and design, encoded harm and encoded possibility, and use our analysis to explore what potentials the study holds for theorizing queer experience with and through interaction design. In a final set of concerns, the study exposes some of the tensions around exposing bias around queerness, but also using that bias towards new and unexpected ends. Across our engagements, we noticed that Alexa's advice mobilized assumptions about my body and ability, social networks, and hearing ability during the time of my queer breakup, a time when culturally informed particular forms of care are of heightened importance and sensitivity. The harmful assumptions baked into digital assistants, voice assistants, and recommender systems, and other technologies of capture, such as camera and film, have been well documented. And routinely, these biases function under a set of assumptions about a normative user. But what if a bias that is designed to help an imagined, more normative person ends up also being helpful to an unimagined queer person? And does this mean that the design was already queer or queer enough all along? In the case of my breakup, the bias was audible when I was instructed by Alexa to go for a walk, talk to a friend, or listen to music. And despite feeling like the advice from the Alexa wasn't really for me during this queer breakup, my choice to suspend that judgment and to follow this advice led to some relief from my heartache. And this, as I said, complicated our understanding of bias. We considered how an encoded misunderstanding or erasure might sometimes actually help the people who are most often excluded, invisibilized, or dehumanized by digital assistants. The queer use of advice from voice assistants like Alexa might mean following the script that is given, and then seeing how, when, or if it holds up to the particulars of a queer person's lived experience. The moments of breakdown, when the advice is no longer relevant to the queer person or people involved, further confirms that these systems invisibilize queer lives in non-trivial and non-deterministic ways. A device's misreading of queer lives will never fully determine queer experience. In this paper, we presented a combined autoethnographic and design inquiry into domestic sonic technologies and queer experience. And by following one person's experiences across 2 homes, 2 Alexa devices, and 2 queer relationships, we explored the contours of encoding queerness and our queer phobia in voice assistant devices, design approaches, and designed interactions. Across 9 months of use, and after processing 3 weeks of sonic breakup data from Amazon's Alexa, we learned that glitches in voice assistant prescripts are interwoven with the soundscapes of everyday life, and that Alexa's recordings can challenge a sense of non-normative time through reminders and memories. Our sonic experimentation led to further insights about the richness of voice assistant recordings, how Alexa's system differentiates across voices, and how its processes of translation and transcription reveal opportunities for countering queer erasure. We end the paper with potential strategies for design researchers to bring more nuance and complexity to the limitations wrought by binary and queerphobic logics, bringing new attention to the forms of queer resistance inherent in everyday lived experience with smartness at home. Looking back at this work now, I think that this phrase of "it's not you, it's me," which is a very common, almost trope that people will say during breakups, rings very true. Working on this project and working with these devices, living with these devices in my home has encouraged me to consider the ways that when things do not go right or as planned in these systems, it's not always a matter of user error or human error. That is, this might be at the level of culture or being queer. And we should not change how we are as queer people because these devices might not recognize that. Rather, I am curious about how we might move on in our designs of these devices to allow for more flexibility and allow for more programmability that is compatible with queer living, queer lives, and queer lifestyles. Thank you all for listening. I really appreciate this opportunity, and I'm looking forward to hearing whatever may have resonated with you all from this talk today.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brian. So we're kind of in a panel format now, so we're going to switch over to the second part, if that works, or we could do questions. What do you think, Dustin? Would make sense?
You know, I think whatever you guys want to do, I'm flexible, you know. So if you guys want to talk back and forth, if you want to take some questions as part of that process, you know, it's up to you.
I mean, since this is fresh, there is one thing I could have asked to start a little bit, and then I can jump in with the second part, which is just Brian, you can share one of the experiments, like the design experiments, if you recall any that you think would be useful to share, because that's kind of the design inquiry part of the.
Yeah, that sounds
example.
really interesting. That would be great to hear a bit more about that.
Mhm. Do you mean like the audio remixing that we did?
Yeah, like the one in the beginning, or any of the
Yes, the one
any
that
of the design examples. Yeah.
the one from the beginning is the only one that I have in this slide deck. So I'm happy to talk more about that or to show.
Or just just explaining it. I think any.
Okay. Yeah. So
Or describe another one. Yeah, exactly.
yeah. So this screenshot is of GarageBand, which is the tool that I use to do the audio remixing because it was already really familiar to me and pretty simple to use. And so in doing this process of audio experimentation, it's quite linked to our data analysis and to further exploring sort of embodied effects of these sounds over time, but then how we might be able to reimagine or change even our relationship to these sounds. And so, although these sounds came from a time of heartache, heartbreak, and a lot of pain, the fact that I was able to make this composition of sounds that I find to be really pleasurable and nice to listen to now is really exciting to me. I think that there's a lot of potential too in these audio remixing methods because there are so many devices and services that are recording in different ways, and exploring this along with the textual transcriptions of what people say or what these devices or digital assistants may say. I think that there's a lot of potential for using the sound to experiment with how we understand layers of sounds over time and also layers of sound to many of these recordings are so rich in terms of the background noises that they have and other sounds. And so it really, that process of looping and listening to the sound over and over and over again can make you more aware and make you more capable of noticing these sounds in your everyday life.
So you collected all of the material that Alexa records. You were able to download it and go through it. I'm really curious about. I mean, in some ways, I feel like what you're describing answers a bit of Yasmin's question that's in the chat here about sort of the sort of methods of your analysis. You know, you're really kind of doing a deep dive, a close kind of listen to the recordings. But you also talked about sort of like translation and transcription within, I assume this is kind of a reference to some of the files that you had access to that you were able to download and look at, you know, and I don't know, when you were talking, I also thought it would be great to just like this to be the premise of for like a novel, you know, like to get the sort of like the rich detail of like your life and the stories, and then thinking about sort of the role that Alexa plays. But I have to say, this is kind of funny. Your talk triggered Alexa in my kitchen just down the room. Started, which that was pretty funny.
That is super funny. I have presented this work in different ways, and there's often at least one person on the call who says like, oh, my devices are going off. And so it's funny. I thought about giving warnings for that, but I think it's interesting that it happens. I'm very flattered by your comment about sort of like the richness of this story and the storytelling there. And I really appreciate you sharing that with me, and also just encouraging me to maybe go even deeper with sort of the richness of this process and these activities. We worked with the sounds from the Alexa devices, and I had to request them from Amazon in order to get that. And it took a few weeks, but then they eventually sent me this zip file that just had like all of the audio from all of my devices and I wanted it all. And so I got it all. They give it to you, but it's very unstructured. And it's not always easy to find the sound clips that align with different entries from the transcript. And so it's quite a bit of data to work with. Most of the entries are very mundane things, like me turning a light on and off in my home. But then there are other ones that, of course, like in the examples that I shared today, are a bit less everyday and kind of maybe questions that we might not think to ask voice assistants at first. And I think it's that question of what kinds of discussions should we be having with them or not, I think is still unanswered, and we're figuring it out as we go.
No, that's fascinating. You know, it reminds me, there's a number of students of mine in different classes and projects and whatnot that have been sort of using this ability to download, you know, data from service providers as a starting point, right? Like, I think it's a very interesting approach in terms of kind of self-reflecting, to look at one's own sort of like the data that's being collected from these third-party, you know, platforms. So that's really interesting. What about the sort of, was this something that you realized was like a topic you wanted to study after, or was this something that, you know, I'm just curious, like what the process was for you in terms of just realizing you were going to focus in on this?
Yeah, I appreciate that question a lot, because it's not always an easy story to tell. I started this research with a few, after noticing a few things in using the voice assistant device at home with my partner. So we noticed that the voice assistant devices tended to confuse or had trouble differentiating between both of our voices. And from there, I continued to ask sort of questions around queerness and domesticity to see sort of how these devices might be interacting with queer people or people in general. And I guess sort of like how queerness is handled or understood or misunderstood by these devices. In the process of doing that, I entered a relationship, and I did not plan on that happening. And I also then talked with that person about this study and the devices, and asked them if they would be interested in participating in this inquiry that we were doing, and showed them the devices, showed them the interfaces for accessing the data and how data could be deleted, and all of those things. And then, of course, the relationship came to an end after about 3 months-ish. And with that, you have all this data from that time and from that time right afterwards. And so I think that pivoting towards looking at the data and the time during and like directly after the breakup was unexpected, but also was just kind of a way of rolling with the punches with the project as well, to be honest. Like, this thing happened, and instead of shy away from it or think that that made the study flawed or not valid anymore, I wanted to leverage it and see like, okay, well, I had this major life event happen to me, and I know that there's other people out there in the world who have this happen to them. So what can we do if you're in this situation and you have access to these devices that are recording all the time? And whether people use the recordings or not, they're still being generated. And that is really fascinating to me, that so many of these devices are in so many homes, and that we often don't stop to look at the history within them. And so I've grown to like look at it very regularly, and I'll be like, oh yeah, I said that funny thing 2 days ago. What was that? And I can just pull it up on my phone. And I think that's interesting. And there are material consequences to storing all that data. And so I have concerns about that as well, from a sustainability standpoint, and just from like a necessity standpoint. Nonetheless, these things are in our homes and they're recording all the time. And so I figured, what if we use that sound to learn some different things about particular facets of ourselves in our lives?
Yeah, I'm also curious about like, what did the data look like that you got from Amazon, right? Like, some, like very just very concrete sort of details of what did that sort of zip file, what did it look like?
Mhm. Um,
How was it organized? What other types of files were in there besides the audio recordings?
yes, there is metadata um, of all kinds of many different sorts. I mean, one of the most prevalent is a timestamp. So almost everything is timestamps, like down to like fractions of a second. But apart from that, the data is arranged with what appear to be randomized file names and strings. And there is a sort of, there's a graph that they give you that you can look to find a cryptographic hash and then align it with what the entry for that is. And so it's a very intensive process. And through some reading, I've learned that maybe in some cases, Amazon doesn't even know where the file is necessarily because they're stored in all these very complicated ways across multiple platforms. So the files themselves look like if somebody gave you a folder that had a bunch of MP4s in it, or any WAV files. Most of them are WAV files. And I didn't include them in my slide deck for today, but the working with it is a little bit intimidating because there can be so many entries and so much data. And they're just like 2-second sound clips, but that itself is still like another file within the collection. So it is fairly disorganized, and there's a lot of friction from Amazon and from their platforms to retrieving them. So it's kind of hidden within the settings, and you have to go settings and then history and then also go this other step. And it's not really apparent to somebody who hasn't like sought out to do this. Like I had to find tutorials, like how do you download all these things to do all this stuff. So I am also interested by the friction that they design into their own platforms that makes it harder for us to use this.
Yes, of course. Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, so Yasmin has another question in her comment here, which is about mental health and the extent to which, your research is sort of touching on this, but also I think this sort of, broader sort of like, to what extent do you think these, voice assistants can, fill this sort of service, like, can they actually, provide assistance in terms of mental health? I mean, I think, this is a little bit somewhat related to that, which is, I guess, this kind of question of the extent to which kind of queer identity plays is a critical factor when thinking about these kinds of interactions, and like, how do we actually, sort of identify the types of interactions where suddenly this becomes an important factor or not. I don't know, like, because you're talking about like the, in terms of like normative values, right? It's so kind of pervasive, and a lot of the sort of interactions that you're describing are potentially involve pulling content from online, right? From the web, that like I don't know to what extent the interaction design around like what is happening there versus the content that's being pulled online is like the source of like the bias, but I don't know, back to the sort of mental health thing. I think that's yeah. So what are your thoughts on all of that?
Yeah, I think that both questions are related. I'm sorry that I missed this part of your question, Yasmin. This is a really good question. There's a ton of work being done out there on this, and I do not think of myself as one of these people who's doing it. However, using voice user interfaces, or what people call VUIs, for mental health, and especially taking different kinds of inventories or sort of assessments with people. There are many tactics that are being developed and actually deployed as well, and people are using these services today. You can also think about earlier automation with earlier technologies of phones and telephones, and phone trees as one of these sorts of interventions as a technology. It's not a voice assistant, but we still use them for many similar uses, including mental health. I think that the voice assistants could be designed to fill these sorts of services. And in doing so, there's of course a risk of different sorts of biases being enacted by those devices in those mental health interactions or assessments or whatever kinds of conversation that may be. And so you could also look towards chatbots and AI. So those are textual, but there are many services as well that are being developed for that explicit purpose. And many of these use AI and ML technologies in their systems to try to do predictive or recommend sort of lines of treatment for people. I think that my opinion is also that there's a lot of value to having a human somewhere in that loop. And so I think that I get nervous when we talk about like completely automating these processes, especially when we're talking about health, because I mean, it's very fascinating because in some ways technologies are better at detecting a lot of things than humans. And then in other ways, humans are better at detecting some other things. And so I think that it's more about having those conversations with teams of designers and technologists to understand sort of how you balance that within the system, and maybe how we might be able to collaborate with the AI and ML as opposed to be displaced by it. Thank you for your question. I really appreciate it.
Really great engagement and so awesome to hear your responses, Brian.
Oh, thank you.
Is it a good time, Dustin, you think?
Yeah, do you have slides you want to share?
I do.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Yeah, let's
Okay.
yeah.
Well, yay again, Brian. I love that talk and appreciate that work so much. Okay, so my segue, I'll try and make the segue, is the design experiment, surprise, actually I'm going to argue, reorient our senses, our bodies, our experiences in relation to algorithmic systems. And in particular, I'm going to talk about the concept of bias as not the outcome, but that reorientation itself. So sharing my screen. Tell me if you see it. Does that show up for folks? Okay, great. So this talk, this sort of second part of the talk is on bias, thinking a little deeply about the concept and potential sort of reconfigurations. And it comes out of a range of conversations, collaborations with dear colleagues at the University of Washington and beyond. In particular, Aphrodite Psara and Gabrielle Ben Abdallah have been instrumental in developing a series of exercises I'll talk about. But it's also in conversation with several texts that have been coming out on topics of bias, right? And thinking about how algorithmic systems are, they're not just instantiations of bias, they're actually reflecting the world around them, right? And the sort of nature and sort of character of bias is interwoven with that world. So to begin, maybe in an unusual site, I'm gonna sort of focus in on this one moment in 2014. This is a TEDx talk that an Australian Sudanese author, mechanical engineer named Yasmin Abdelmajid is giving a talk on kind of the classic formula of like the striking question that's beginning the performance. And she says, someone who looks like me walks past you on the street. Do you think they're a mother, a refugee, or a victim of oppression? Or do you think they're a cardiologist, a barrister, or maybe your local politician? So what she's doing is talking about bias, right? In this case, she's wearing a kind of copper coral colored hijab that's gently draping around her head and neck. And it's complementing her abaya, which is this long embroidered cloak. And her point is really clear, right? She says, the world expects of me, and the way I'm treated depends on the arrangement of this piece of cloth, this sort of signal of who she is, right? And this is about looking beyond that signal, about looking beyond what she calls your bias. So for her, as for many of us, bias is referring to this kind of habit of mind, right? It's a tendency, we look at the Oxford English Dictionary, to favor or dislike a person or thing, especially as a result of a preconceived opinion, right? An assumption. So maybe a stereotype about someone based on characteristics like race, gender, disability, religion. And in this TEDx theater, it's really describing how the audience, many probably are white and Judeo-Christian, are seeing this piece of cloth, making a sort of negative assumptions about who she is as a Muslim woman of color in the audience, in this context. And the cloth is then exposing that, right? That audience's bias. But what she does not mention is that very arrangement of cloth is not just revealing bias, but it is bias, right? It is bias of a certain kind. The cloth is draping with something called textile grain or bias grain. It's the strands of thread that are traversing the body, not on this sort of up and down of the weave, but on the diagonal, the slant. So from this textile etymology, bias refers to, quote, slanting or sloping line or diagonal, right? A line running from to the warp or weft or at an angle of that woven fabric. So to a tailor, right, that bias is then specifically talking about that powerful tilt. It's a tool. When you think of interlocking threads that run horizontally and vertically, this is now the grain that's running along that angle on this between the two. So to cut then on the bias is to intentionally skew woven material to allow for gravity to do its work. It's kind of pushing against the grain and disrupting the binary, right? So working along the bias makes any number of things possible, from the headscarf to cloth diapers to haute couture, so these like very fancy gowns. So when she's speaking a few years, this is 2014, right? Before bias has now sort of infiltrated our thinking on machine learning and data science, right? This is before Shalini Kantaya's Netflix documentary Coded Bias, or Shima Milner's collective data for Black Lives. And this is sort of, these initiatives are grappling with and trying to address the forms of harm that disproportionately affect people along existing lines of inequity, right? The race, class, gender, disability. And this is on some minds at the time, but it hasn't fully sort of infiltrated the public consciousness when it comes to technology, unless you see textiles as a technology too. So those links between fiber and bits run deep. As many computing historians remind, this is a work of encoding information to be traced to some ancient entanglements, string, sort of pre-Columbian quipus that survived the Spanish colonization. The small knots here are put into these colorful threads that are signifying specific categories of knowledge. And centuries later, you've probably heard the stories of computing sort of legacies in the tactile dimensions, sort of when British Countess Ada Lovelace gestured at the connection, right, between these worlds and said, we may say most aptly that the analytic engine, that early form of computer, weaves algebraic patterns just as the jacquard loom weaves flowers and leaves, seeing the alliance between the computer and as a weaving machine. But it also, this connection points to important patterns of exploitation, right, that are within the early decades of the computing industry. So these are times when profits are compelled from gendered racialized subjects, Navajo women in Shiprock, New Mexico, manufacturing chips, probably for free, the operators in Waltham, Massachusetts, who are wiring code that sent the the Apollo spacecraft to the moon and back. These are case studies of kind of moments when stereotypes associated with nimble fingers and textile propensities are kind of justified, right? Or justifying rather that extraction of labor from minoritarian workers. So wires here working as threads and units of digital memory are, working in quilts, and techniques of embroidery that are encoding the path to the moon and back. These are all sort of moments that start to shape how we understand these relationships between pattern and skew. And it doesn't take a giant leap of imagination to see how the chips of computers have grain, have that thread and thread count, and how cutting along a bias can produce something wildly new. So that's what I began to explore. I was extremely lucky in the fall of this past fall, 2021, designing with Afrodite Prasara and Gabrielle Banamdala a series of exercises that we developed, that we worked on with data science students in a course that we titled On the Bias. And in this course, it was designed for undergraduates, but actually drew from a range of programs and levels, began the whole experience with a simple exercise, a piece of cloth and scissors. So we asked students to cut that piece of cloth on the bias and create a data set. They could create the data set by, photographing things, by listening to the cuts, by organizing the pieces of cloth that were made up afterwards. But in each case, they had to materialize something that otherwise is quite immaterial for many of us working with data, which is, right, you have to make decisions, and those decisions matter. They had that in the collection of data, those decisions shape the data themselves, right? The kinds of algorithms that could be, or the kinds of algorithmic systems that could be developed. So one student, for example, who did listen to his soundscape was trying to sort of chart the various noise frequencies, connecting with Brian's earlier work, sort of thinking through in what ways they could hear their stress levels change, right? Just from the snips of each cut. My goal for this data set, he said, would be to measure that stress level, right? And speculate if someone is fine or not. But in other cases, it was about the dullness of the tool itself, right? The fact that scissors weren't, or the skill set of the person cutting, feeling that they had a sort of lacking expertise in the cutting dimension. So the exercises that then followed this sort of very direct reference to textile bias became more connected to what materializing this sort of ecology of data science practices could mean for learning about ourselves in the moment. And early on, an undergraduate named Catherine Rees used the OS screen time feature, right, on Mac phones, the iPhone, to record data, and then used cut pieces of cloth to represent each of the touches. So she created a kind of information visualization, right, from the felt, with each color representing a different moment in the day when she'd been touching the screen. And she describes collecting this data and materializing made me reflect on the movement between virtual and actual space, noticing the differences in my inhabitation of each and the constant of my own bodily presence, right, in both. And just this act of working with the fabric in this context actually, of course, it prompted that reflection, right? It prompted a kind of reorientation, right, of her body toward data that's collected all around her every day. In her final exhibition, we had invited all the students to start from a data set and create a new or reinvented object. And she began with a textile again, But this time she looked to a kind of weaving pattern, which is originally from the Philippines, Ilocos and Abra regions, where her family's from. So it was a pattern that's called binako, and it uses a repetition and curvature to warp the geometries of a 90-degree grid. So contemporary comparisons to 1960s op art kind of show the dominance of Western weaving ontologies amid these longer indigenous textile lineages. And they're really threatened by that, the sort of dwindling access to natural resources, but also the scarce documentation, right, of those. So training the machine learning model on the textile images, Catherine then was producing this sort of algorithmically generated Binkel imagery. She developed a film surrounding it that animates between the imagery and projected that alongside a description of one of the surviving pre-war master weavers working with Binkel. She describes a kind of absence of tangibility that was made visible through the institutional effort to sustain this dying art. And a final example of this sort of remaking of the artifact, a PhD student, Shariel Glavovac-Smith, created a series of images that encode Audre Lorde's excerpts from Audre Lorde's poems in algorithmically generated photographs of braided black hair. So she created these images by training a machine learning model on sort of photographs, right, to produce these synthetic but also realistic renderings. They're almost impossible geometries. Exploring the angularity of the techniques, they noticed a set of unique but uniform patterns, much like a language. So leveraging this patterning, they developed an algorithm that created a kind of braided image as text, mapping each of the phrases in the poems to the unique hairstyle. And they describe, in reflecting on this, holding space for the dichotomy between society's demonization of Black hair expression and simultaneous appropriation of that same expression. So treating sort of these algorithmic generated images as a kind of language, they reinvented a covert kind of art of Black hair. So across these bias cuts and binnacle patterns and braided poetry, on the bias projects were sharing a particular sensibility, right? They're not removing harmful forms of data collection or machine learning bias, but they're really complicating these kinds of patterns. They're infusing neural networks with a kind of poetic force that's reorienting our senses. In her essays on orientation, Sarah Ahmed considers how the phrase, sexual orientation helps expose what queerness offers for considering objects that orient phenomenological traditions. But orientation for Ahmed refers to that effect of what we tend toward. So that which shapes and ingrains a body's capacities to see and comprehend. And identifying angularities in design, she later explores the kind of winding redirection of access of signs that say orient wheelchair users through space or create alternative opportunities for use, a kind of queer use. And in this formulation, being upright or straight identifies a particular accomplishment, whereas being topsy-turvy marks a departure from the norm. A kind of complementary or adjacent take on this is what performance theorist Kemi Adeyemi calls the lean, which is this reading that she begins with the bodies, the leaning bodies of 21 Black women and gender nonconforming people in Rashid Newman's shade compositions. Kemi's calling for, quote, doing away with up and down and beginning and from other angles to do and theorize politics, Black and otherwise. So she's connecting the angle of performers' bodies with the refusal of masculinist, ableist, and racist vantage points. She says, quote, I'm thinking about the literal ground a lot lately because I've spent far too much time watching people like Walter Scott, being ground into it. So reflecting on the everyday forms of police brutality, the horizontal then evokes a form of carceral enforcement for Black and Indigenous people, whereas the vertical is delimiting the ideas of good posture or uprightness or standing tall, right? So this is a kind of resistance to the dominance of 90 degrees, as well as the tethering to the ground. So amid these skewed orientations and leads, what we're finding is not an answer, not a solution or ending, nothing you can turn into a commodity or apply to our wounds or move from place to place. But what we're seeing is a kind of techno-poetics, an experimental kind of practice, right? That begins maybe with angularities of fabric. So fabric, right, is a material gathering of strings, just different lines and timelines, and with them a kind of convening of different histories and social relationships and even possibilities, right, within our collective present. So these pedagogical experiments are drawing on angularities and other AI experiments to really organize bias as an opportunity. So they're bringing a material imagination to our contact with skewed perspectives and with one another. Returning to that TEDx stage, fabric's telling then a particular story about bias, that something material like a hijab is shaping something cultural, a negative assumption, but it's also to use that orientation, to collectively work against the grain and to skew our relationships with everyday use. So turning our material conditions into an invitation for change. So within the conventional problem solved or issue resolved, the angle of our engagement matters. And with that, I would love to share more and talk more about all things bias and ML related in the techno-poetic realm. Really thrilled to be here and thanks.
Yeah, thank you. That was really, really interesting, set of examples. And I think, sort of concluding on this idea of the sort of techno-poetics is fascinating, because I think often there's this kind of desire to somehow solve these problems. But the more, I don't know, the more I've sort of kind of sat with this stuff and thought about it, it just seems like there's a kind of inevitable tension and conflict, when talking about sort of norms and bias, things are shifting, like it's always in flux a little bit, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, it's very much this conversation of like AI as a distraction, really, from real problems, where the kind of the way bias is deployed as a kind of, if there's something wrong with the technology, we can fix it. And then we can still go on with that sort of techno capitalist agenda in any realm, right? Versus an idea of maybe understanding there might be something interesting in these systems, but it's not what we thought. And it's not the thing that's distracting us from addressing societal problems. It's actually potentially ways of just seeing ourselves and understanding how we really in the world and using it in that sort of more arts oriented or arts grounded tradition.
Yeah. Are there any questions? Anybody want to chime in? This is, seize the day. This is your moment. If you have questions, just jump in there. If you don't, that's okay too. But well, I think that's the sound of people thinking.
Yeah, well, it's late in the day. We're all ready for dinner. I eat early.
Yeah. Well, thank you. This was really interesting. It was really great. I look forward to hearing more about it as things progress, with your research, Brian. So thanks
So much.
for coming. So
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you all.